In analyzing the profound political shock that has followed Donald Trump's most recent eruption on Truth Social, one must resist the temptation to interpret the episode as merely another instance of presidential intemperance or digital spectacle, and instead consider how it illuminates the structural dilemmas currently undermining the constitutional equilibrium of American governance. In this particular case, a routine House Budget Committee hearing, ordinarily among the least dramatic activities in the congressional calendar, served as the catalyst for a conflict that exposed not only Trump's persistent inability to tolerate intra-party scrutiny, but also the increasingly brittle relationship between presidential authority and legislative oversight. The hearing, held on December 3rd, was intended to examine the administration's proposed spending priorities for the forthcoming fiscal year, a process as standard as it is constitutionally mandated, and Republican legislators, many of whom have been among Trump's most loyal defenders, posed predictably technocratic questions concerning agricultural subsidies, discretionary cuts, and the rural economic implications of shifting federal appropriations. What transformed this otherwise procedural exercise into a national political crisis was the president's reaction, perceiving queries from Representative Tom Cole, a veteran Oklahoma Republican with deep roots in the appropriations process, not as constitutionally legitimate oversight but as personal betrayal. Trump initiated a barrage of posts, 17 by day's end, attacking Cole and other Republicans by name, questioning their loyalty to the so-called MAGA movement, and escalating toward language that legal analysts quickly identified as implicitly threatening. Such behavior from a president, let alone a president who styles himself as the leader of a populist movement defined by absolute loyalty, is not without precedent historically. The literature on executive populist conflict, both comparative and domestic, consistently demonstrates that populist executives tend to collapse institutional criticism into personal treason, construing legislative autonomy as sabotage and refusing to recognize the legitimacy of shared constitutional authority. Yet what distinguishes the December 3rd episode is not simply Trump's rhetorical aggression. The American political system has endured presidents who berated legislators before, but the manner in which those attacks mobilized a digital constituency whose demonstrated willingness to engage in political intimidation fundamentally alters the calculus of congressional decision-making. It is one thing for a president to excoriate legislators for insufficient loyalty. It is another when such excoriation leads congressional offices to receive death threats, forces staff to consult Capitol Police on enhanced security measures, and prompts senators within the president's own party to publicly contemplate whether the president's continuation in office poses a threat to democratic governance. In this respect, the episode bears direct relevance to political science theories of democratic erosion, particularly those that emphasize what Nancy Bermeo has termed executive aggrandizement, the incremental weakening of rival institutions through informal pressure, and what Levitsky and Ziblatt frame as the substitution of institutional checks with loyalty-based compliance. When Senator Lisa Murkowski issued a statement on December 4th calling Trump's behavior unacceptable and urging serious conversations about whether he should remain in office, she was not merely responding to a volatile media cycle, but articulating a tacit recognition that the separation of powers cannot function if legislators conducting routine oversight are treated as enemies of the people and subjected to extra-institutional retaliation. Mitt Romney went further, describing Trump's behavior as dangerous and potentially criminal, and calling for his resignation, thereby making explicit what had previously circulated only as whispered concern among establishment Republicans, that the president's behavior had crossed a threshold from political deviation into constitutional threat. Political scientists studying intra-party conflict will immediately recognize the strategic dilemma this creates for the Republican Party. On the one hand, the MAGA faction, which constitutes a significant portion of the party's electoral base, treats loyalty to Trump as the primary condition of partisan identity and regards any criticism as betrayal. On the other hand, institutionalist conservatives, still operating within the traditional ideological frameworks of limited government and constitutional constraint, understand understand that the legislative branch cannot be subjected to presidential intimidation without collapsing its co-equal status. This is, in effect, a conflict between party as movement and party as institution, and the party cannot simultaneously satisfy both imperatives indefinitely. The matter becomes more complex once we integrate the security dimension. Trump not only labeled Cole and others traitors, a term that in his rhetorical framework carries extra-legal connotations, but he also posted their office phone numbers and encouraged supporters to let them know what real Americans think, prompting a surge of threats so severe that Capitol Police were forced to intervene. From an academic standpoint, one must acknowledge that the United States has entered a phase in which the line between presidential rhetoric and political violence is no longer speculative. January 6th provided an empirical demonstration that presidential cues can and do translate into coordinated extra-institutional action. Thus, when legal experts such as Joyce Vance and Andrew Weissman argue that the December 3rd posts may constitute criminal intimidation of federal officials under 18 U.S. Code, paragraph 115, they are not engaging in hyperbole but assessing a real and measurable risk. Indeed, the causal chain between Trump's rhetoric and the behavioral responses of his followers is now sufficiently well established that even scholars who previously hesitated to attribute intentionality are revising their assessments. What deepens the crisis is not merely the possibility that Trump committed a federal offense, but the fact that his reaction to criticism, doubling down, escalating threats, and promising electoral retribution against dissenting Republicans demonstrates a governing psychology fundamentally incompatible with the logic of shared constitutional authority. Presidents who conceive of oversight as war inevitably govern as if politics were a loyalty test, and the Republican officials now contemplating resignation calls are implicitly recognizing that a presidency structured around loyalty cannot coexist with a legislature structured around autonomy. The consequences for governance are profound. Routine oversight becomes hazardous. Legislators must weigh policy questions against personal security, and polarization becomes not merely ideological, but existential. Comparative political science offers sobering parallels. Democratic backsliding rarely begins with the formal dissolution of institutions, but with the gradual normalization of intimidation, the erosion of mutual toleration, and the replacement of institutional negotiation with factional coercion. Within this framework, Trump's latest meltdown is not a deviant outburst, but a continuation of a pattern observable from his treatment of Mitch McConnell, Liz Cheney, Mike Rounds, and Kevin McCarthy. Loyalty is never cumulative, dissent is unforgivable, and constitutional roles are subordinate to personal allegiance. What makes the December episode uniquely destabilizing is that it precipitated open discussion among Republican elites about resignation, an option previously considered beyond the boundaries of plausible intra-party action. This fact alone signals a structural shift. Political parties act as gatekeepers in democracies. When gatekeepers begin to contemplate removing their own president for threatening institutional stability, it means the party has recognized that the costs of maintaining unity now exceed the costs of rupture. Democrats, for their part, observed the unfolding Republican crisis with a mixture of normative concern and strategic opportunism, aware that the spectacle of a president threatening legislators from his own party undermines Republican claims to responsible governance and strengthens arguments that Trump's leadership poses systemic risks. But the implications extend well beyond electoral advantage. If Congress retreats from oversight out of fear, if legislators begin calculating the personal danger associated with their constitutional duties, or if loyalty to a president becomes the dominant axis of intra-party organization, then the separation of powers collapses not by formal decree but through intimidation-induced dormancy. The American constitutional system presumes that each branch will defend its prerogatives should Congress fail to defend its oversight function, not because it doubts its authority, but because it fears retaliation. The system ceases to operate as designed. Trump's insistence on total loyalty and his willingness to mobilize followers against legislators represent precisely the type of executive-driven illiberal pressure that scholars of democratic decline identify as early-stage authoritarian consolidation. The fact that this pressure now operates intra-party rather than purely interbranch suggests an especially volatile dynamic. Parties normally function as stabilizers by disciplining leaders, yet in populist movements, leaders discipline parties. Thus, the events triggered by the December 3rd hearings serve as a case study in the fragility of democratic norms when confronted by a leader who collapses constitutional roles into personal loyalty tests. Whether Trump ultimately resigns or remains in office is less important than whether Congress succeeds in reasserting its capacity for independent oversight. For if the legislative branch cannot question a president without incurring threats, and if members of the president's own party must choose between constitutional duty and personal safety, then the United States is no longer functioning as a system of checks and balances, but as a loyalty hierarchy masquerading as a constitutional republic, a transformation whose consequences will reverberate far beyond the current news cycle and shape the trajectory of American democracy for years to come.